Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and on this three-part series about the ferry, we're going to be taking a look at the history of Hull's beloved Humber Ferry, which ended in 1981 with the opening of the Humber Bridge. In this first episode, we're going to take a look at the history of Humber ferries in general, and how one in particular, the new Holland Ferry, came to dominate. Now, the history of the ferry across the Humber goes back a lot further than just a couple of hundred years. In fact, the earliest recorded ferry goes back almost 2,000 years to the age of the Romans, when a couple of miles further upstream up the Humber at Bruff, there was their first recorded crossing, a ferry that the Romans called Transitus Maximus, which literally means really big ferry. I love the literalness of the name, it's awesome. Bruff, by the way, was known as Petvaria. Now, it's entirely likely that the earlier Celts and the Britons that they displaced probably also had boats doing ferries backwards and forwards, but they were notoriously bad at writing things down, so we don't really have any record of them. There are legends that suggest that the Romans used to occasionally walk across the Humber at particularly low tides. But given that the Romans weren't mad and they did use boats a lot, it's probably more likely that they just used boats. I don't know. I would have just thought that would have been easier than waiting for once or twice a year when there was a ridiculously low tide. But who am I to judge? The Vikings, no stranger to using boats, also used to cross the Humber, and the Norse names of North Ferriby and South Ferriby hint that these were the opposite ends of a ferry route, and whilst there were undoubtedly many different crossings, nothing else is actually documented until the 14th century, when, in 1316, King Edward II granted a charter for a ferry between the newly minted Kingstown upon Hull and the town of Barton in Lincolnshire, and it would cost passengers half a penny more for horses and carts. As time went on, there were all manner of unofficial river crossings. Most of the Lincolnshire villages near the river had a market boat that they would use to cross to Hull to sell their wares, and they would often unofficially take passengers, much to the annoyance of those running the official, royally sanctioned ferry. In the 18th century, Hull Corporation bought the lease to this ferry and were faced with a swarm of these unofficial crossings. Not only that, the corporation also faced protest too, as they hiked the price. In 1831, a reformer, James Ackland, said that the King's Charter had stated a halfpenny for passage, and the corporation were charging at least sixpence. He vowed to start his own ferry service, bought a small boat, and started offering passage at halfpenny. However, it turns out that 500 years of inflation means that even running a small boat, let alone a large coal-fired ferry, was not really sustainable on a halfpenny, and Ackland was forced to raise his price to fourpence, which still undercut the corporation's ferry. As the Industrial Revolution cracked on apace and Hull became one of the biggest ports in the country, the Humber became full of ships waiting for their turn at the harbour. This was somewhat alleviated in the late 18th century by the building of Hull's first dock, later renamed Queen's Dock, but the entry to this dock was still via the River Hull, and the queues of ships waiting their turn still blocked access to Corporation Pier, where the ferry was supposed to dock. And this often led passengers to have to pass over the decks of several large vessels or be taken from the ferry on small rowboats just to get ashore. But before Ackland's little protest ferry started, back in the 1820s, another man, Tommy Dent, was running a ferry to a small creek almost directly opposite Hull at a spot that would become known as New Holland. In 1820, a man called Tommy Dent set himself up a ferry business to New Holland, and he did so despite owning nothing more than a fairly small rowboat. Now, you might think that's an unusual choice to go toe-to-toe with a legitimate ferry business that ran a paddle steamer, and you'd be right. But I'll go into the details as to why in the next episode in this mini-series, where we'll be talking a little bit more about Dent and about the development of New Holland as a whole. Needless to say, by 1825, to his surprise, the ferry was doing enormously well. So he actually was quite ready to sell to the first people who came along, and the first people who came along happened to be a legitimate company by the name of the New Holland Proprietors, a company formed by a man called Joseph Brown and his friends. Now, when they bought the ferry, they had big plans. They really did plan to take this and make it into a serious going concern. They bought a paddle steamer named the Magna Charta. They built a jetty for the charter to actually dock at, and they built a massive inn, the Yarborough Arms. Now, behind me, this is the 1851 Yarborough Arms, which was a rebuild of the original, because the original was getting too small and they needed to drive the railway through onto the ferry. Another thing that the proprietors decided to do was to make a road linking New Holland with the rest of Lincolnshire in order to try and attract the stagecoach and mail packet businesses, very lucrative businesses in the early parts of the 19th century. I'll be covering the meteoric rise from nowhere of New Holland in the next part of this three-part series, but it was Joseph Brown who really put the place on the map. Magna Charta was the first serious competition the Corporation Ferry to Barton had ever faced, and it was indeed starting to take huge chunks out of their income, and it was undercutting them on price to boot. The reformist protester Ackland gave up his protest ferry and instead supported Brown's venture. By 1832, the Magna Charta was making 3 round trips a day between the Corporation Pier in Hull and the jetty in New Holland, and was achieving such success that they added some smaller boats for passengers and a special hoss boat for horses. With Lincolnshire being prime farming territory, indeed some of my own ancestors on my dad's side were farm workers across the Humber around this time, the ferry was also used to ship livestock, and there are accounts of panicked cows jumping overboard and swimming back to New Holland, or jumping out between the ferry and the pier at Hull and being rescued by workers and onlookers. The ferry was becoming so successful that by 1844, larger and greedier eyes were swivelling towards it, including, rumour has it, the railway king himself, George Hudson, a man who was a titanic figure who strode across the railways and docks of the northeast like a colossus. Now, whether it was out of sense of it was a good business decision, or whether it was out of fear of Hudson creating a complete monopoly over non-sea travel in and out of Hull, one of his main minor rivals, the Great Grimsby and Sheffield Junction Railway, swooped in with a bid of their own. For £10,000, which is nearly $1 million in today's money, they bought all of the New Holland Proprietors' stock of the ferry, including the jetty, the boats, all the infrastructure they built at New Holland, such as the Yarborough Arms. And then shortly afterwards, they themselves were bought by the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway, itself a larger company that was absorbing smaller railways. And they started investing some serious cash here. In fact, it was here at Corporation Pier, now better known as Victoria Pier, that they built the first ticket office, which is a building just across there in Nelson Street. And it was there that you could buy a ticket to get on the ferry and then get straight on a train on the other end when the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway actually built their railways up to New Holland, making it Hull's only railway station that didn't actually have a train line next to it. Further advancements that they made was to also make a deal with the corporation to improve Corporation Pier by adding a floating pontoon for embarkation and disembarkation off the ferry, because up until this point the ferries had been simply beaching up on the mudflats and people were just getting off, and it was very tide dependent. Obviously, this with the floating pontoons, which would rise and fall with the tide, meant that they could safely disembark at any time of the day. The railway world was shaken to its roots during the late 1840s, however. The railway bubble had burst. George Hudson's entire empire had, it turned out, been built upon layers of fraud and dodgy dealings, and the confidence in railway investment dropped like a stone, and shareholders were quick to start investigating their own investments. The Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway was the target of 2 shareholder-led investigations to determine if similar fraud was being committed. Whilst both investigations exonerated the company of any fraud, they did bring up a few things the public found unpalatable. One of the board using labour paid for by the company to work on his house and garden, for instance. And so the company reshuffled its board of directors, replacing all but the chair, Lord Yarborough, in order to show that it was putting its house in order. The new Holland Ferry, however, went from strength to strength, despite the fact that railways now existed to quickly travel to the south bank of the Humber, the long way. It was still far cheaper and less time to use the ferry, and with the rapid growth of Hull as it spilled outside the boundaries of the town walls in every direction, Lincolnshire was a prime source of grain and livestock, as well as labourers. As farms everywhere started to become more mechanised thanks to steam traction and mechanised ploughs, more and more farm workers were finding themselves unemployed and heading for the city to try to find work in the factories, docks and railways. In 1851, the Corporation Ferry to Barton finally ceased operations, unable to compete with the faster, cheaper New Holland Ferry. Corporation Pier was renamed Victoria Pier in 1854 after Queen Victoria herself travelled from here to Grimsby, and the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway had the ferry business pretty much sewn up. By 1897 they had a small flotilla of paddle steamers plying the route, including a second Magna Charta, not the original that was scrapped in 1873, the Doncaster, the Sheffield, the Liverpool, the Manchester and the Grimsby, and the company was swallowed up eventually by the Great Central Railway, who invested in new boats and a replacement floating pontoon at both piers. In the 1920s, the Great Central Railway was itself merged with the North Eastern Railway, and in the 1940s it was nationalised and became part of British Railways, whose name and iconic logo the remaining ferries would bear until the closure of the ferry. So one particularly brilliant slice of life on the Humber in the 19th century comes in the form of an enquiry that was actually sent to me by one of the viewers. And it's a fascinating story because it tells of the collision between a trawler, the J, and the Manchester, which was one of the coal-fired paddle steamers that was running the ferry in those days. And the story is actually quite a funny one. Effectively, the trawler set sail from St Andrew's Dock, missing its second hand, but as he was pulling out, the skipper saw the second hand dancing drunkenly on the dockside. With a few shenanigans with a small boat later, he was on board and getting chewed out by the skipper for being clearly drunk when he was supposed to be reporting for duty. But as they were sailing past Albert Dock, a fog bank descended upon the Humber and they had to weigh anchor. They couldn't go anywhere till the fog lifted, so they all went into the engineers' quarters, where it turns out the second hand had brought with him a very large bottle of whiskey, which they all decided to partake in. The skipper, in his account in the inquiry, has no recollection of how the trawler managed to get from Albert Dock to here at Victoria Pier, but he does remember forgetting to set all of the running lights on, leaving only the one anchor light in place. That'll come in quite important later on, and decided to set sail because the fog bank had lifted, but it was the pitch black of night. But instead of sailing that way towards the mouth of the Humber, they set sail that way towards New Holland. And apparently one of the deckhands came out and told the skipper that he was going to crash into the very brightly lit jetty at New Holland, to which the captain responded, "Oh no, there's nothing I can do about it now," even though there was clearly plenty he could do about it, like for instance steer. He hit the pontoons at the jetty at New Holland, then he hit against one of the other ferries that was docked there, had enough presence of mind to actually disentangle himself from that ferry before setting sail straight back into the Humber and onto a collision course with the Manchester, which was steaming its way at that point towards New Holland. Now, from the Manchester's point of view, it was pitch black and they just saw this one tiny light, which they assumed was some sort of rowing boat or a small sailboat. Imagine their surprise when a trawler loomed out of the darkness playing chicken with them and hit them head on. The skipper of the J, the trawler, did have the presence of mind to at least put the engines in full reverse when he realised that he was about to crash into another ship, but it wasn't enough, and the Manchester suffered such extreme damage that for a moment the crew thought that they were hurled and that they were going down. They made a beeline for the shore to try and beach the Manchester. But as it turns out, the Manchester wasn't taking water and it could make its way safely to the pier. Both the skipper and the second hand of the J lost their licences for that, rather justifiably, I would say. There were, of course, over this time, threats to the ferry. In the 1860s and 1870s, prospective railway companies offered to drive at first a tunnel and then a bridge across the river, which would have severely dampened the enthusiasm for the ferry crossing. But when a railway finally did emerge to link Hull to the coalfields of South Yorkshire in 1885, it wasn't to be crossing the Humber, at least not here. It was the Hull and Barnsley Railway, and they chose the much less heavy engineering route of making a smaller bridge over the Ouse near Drax. Closer to the modern day, in the 1960s, for a few months, an enterprising company called Hoverlink actually ran a hovercraft ferry from Hull to Grimsby. But this only lasted for a very short period of time because it turns out that the hovercraft were a little bit too fragile to be running on the Humber. The Humber tends to carry all sorts of debris like big branches and even whole trees that have been fallen down and fallen into the water. And when those sort of things hit the skirts of a hovercraft, it causes damage. And likewise, when they were mooring in Grimsby, the stone walls of the actual dock where they were disembarking, the collisions with that stone wall tended to damage the frames of the hovercraft, and they were withdrawn from ferry service fairly quickly, spending the rest of their lives doing pleasure trips from Cleethorpes. Now, the biggest threat to the ferry of all would have been a road bridge in the 20th century, with the uptake in use of personal cars and, of course, lorries for freight. And there'd been talk of building a road bridge across the Humber since the 1930s, an idea that had constantly been floated when people wanted a bit of political capital during election times. However, it wasn't until the 1960s and the North Hull by-election of 1966 that the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, finally decided to use that as political leverage and gave a cast-iron guarantee that a bridge would indeed be built over the Humber. And even then, it took nearly a decade for construction to begin. Didn't start building until late 71, early 72. And they said it would be complete within a couple of years. Spoiler, it wasn't. And this delay caused problems for the ferry. By now it was being run by a hardy trio of coal paddle steamers, Tattershall Castle, Wingfield Castle and Lincoln Castle, all of whom dated from the 1930s and early 40s and had given sterling service, as we'll see in the last episode in this series, where we'll take a closer look at the lives of each of these three ships in much more detail. But the announcement and construction of the Humber Bridge gave British Rail a reason to skip routine maintenance and run these venerable old paddle steamers down. However, the bridge constantly ran over schedule. The initial 2 years that British Rail had taken so seriously quickly became 4, then 5, and then 6, and it wouldn't be until 1981 that the bridge would finally open. British Rail sorely misjudged their reduced maintenance programme for the castles. Tattershall Castle was the first to fall, suffering a boiler failure after running the ferry single-handedly during 1972 in a coal shortage caused by miners' strikes. In 1974, its sister ship Wingfield Castle started developing issues with its boiler and had to be withdrawn, leaving just Lincoln Castle to run the ferry, and it too was starting to show signs of wear and tear. A diesel-electric ferry came to offer assistance from the Isle of Wight route, the Farringford. Sadly, the Farringford wasn't purpose-built for the rather unique environment of the Humber and was much slower in its crossings than the castles had been, and was often the victim of breakdowns, earning it a local nickname of the mechanical rubbish skip. Poor Farringford was often seen as the outsider by locals. The end finally came for Lincoln Castle in 1978 when it suffered a catastrophic boiler failure en route to New Holland. This left Farringford to run the ferry almost single-handedly for the last 3 years until the Humber Bridge finally opened in 1981. And so it was that this technological marvel finally killed off the Humber Ferry, which had been running solidly as a business since 1820, and a way of crossing the Humber itself that had been at least 2,000 years old. And it's kind of our own fault. In many ways, as a society, we're the ones who decided that we wanted to travel everywhere by car. We're the ones who wanted a bridge instead of going backwards and forwards on the ferry. But it may have been the end for the ferry, but it wasn't entirely the end for the 3 paddle steamers that used to run it. And that is going to be the story of the last of this small 3-part series on the Humber Ferry. On the next 2 episodes of this small series on the Humber Ferry's history, we'll take a look at the growth of a whole new village around the landing spot for the ferry in New Holland. And we'll take a detailed look at the lives of the plucky Castles, the last 3 coal steamers to work ferries in Britain.